All right, in today's video, we're going to be building our list store and our task store for our front end that's going to handle all of our communication with our backend API that we created in the last video. So let's jump into it. So we're going to go down to our client, and the first thing we want to do is create some new stores. So if you remember, we have our auth store, and this is a state management system for everything related to authentication. That's our user data, the login functions, the logout, the register. We also want to make one for tasks and lists. So let's create two new stores called task, and we'll create another one called list. And in here, we're going to define all the variables and the functions for the front end associated to creating lists, adding them, and making those API requests to the backend functionality that we just created. So first, let's import define store from Pinia. We'll import rep from Vue and Axios. All right, now we'll define our default export. We'll call this use list store, and we'll say define store, call it list, and we'll use the setup method. So we pass back a function, and now let's define some variables. So the first variables we're going to define are going to be lists and active list, which is going to be an array. The active list is going to be an ID of the list, or it'll just be null if it's not set. Now we're going to define some different loading variables. And because we might be showing that this is loading in different ways, we're actually going to create a few different loading variables instead of just one. We'll create a regular loading state, one for add, update, and delete. Now we're going to create a couple variables for errors. Now we'll create a function that'll be used to set the active list. And that gets passed a list ID. And now we want functions for getting, adding, updating, and deleting lists. Now we're just going to return back everything that we just created. We also want to return back our error variables and all of our functions. All right, now that we got the scaffolding for this store, let's create some of the functionality. So in get lists, we're going to set the default loading value to true. We'll set the error value to null. And now we want to try catch. And then no matter what happens at the end, we want to set the loading value to false. And now for our get lists function, remember we created an index function, and that's going to return all of our lists. And if you look in our routes, that's at API/lists. So we're going to say response equals await, and we're going to send a get request to API lists. And if that succeeds, we'll set the list value to the response data. And this is our data. So we'll get back the lists as an object, and we'll set that to our lists value. If it fails, we're just going to log the error. All right. Now for add list, we're going to do something pretty similar. We're going to say loading add is true, error is null, and then we'll create a try catch, and we'll set the loading to false at the end. And now for add, we need to send a post request to the lists endpoint. And in our add list, we're going to take in list data. And so we'll say response equals await Axios. We'll post to API/lists. We'll pass in the list data. And if that succeeds, you can see here in our store method, we're just passing back the one list that was created. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our lists value, and it's an array, so we can just push the response data into that array. And then we'll return true to signify that this succeeded. If it fails, we'll console log the whole error object so we can diagnose that. We'll set the value of create errors to the response if it exists, data if it exists, errors property. Or If that's null, we'll just say error, adding list, please try again. And if that fails, we want to return false. Next, we'll work on updating a list. So we'll set the loading update value to true, error to null, and we'll add a try catch. Set that loading update to false. And I just realized that here we set the loading add value to true, but we're set the loading to false. We want to change that to loading add. And then here we set the loading update value to true and the loading update value to false. So for update, we're going to send an Axios patch request. And if you look at our routes, we expect a patch request at lists, and then we pass in the list ID. So this update list method is going to accept a few parameters. That's going to be the list ID that we want to update and the list data. So now we're going to send the request to API lists. And here we're using backticks because that allows us to pass in a variable of list ID. And then we're also going to pass the list data. If that succeeds, we'll return true. But now what we want to do with the response data is a little interesting. We're going to use the JavaScript map function. And so first I'll write out the code and I'll show you how it works. And then I'll explain a little bit of what it's doing. So we'll say lists value equals lists value map. Say list. And we'll say return list ID is equal to the list ID that we just updated. And if so, we want to return the response data. Otherwise, we'll return the current list. And so if you've never used the map function, this might be a little overwhelming, but it's pretty straightforward. So the map function goes through each item in the lists array one by one, and it lets us transform or update the items and returns a brand new array. So in this example, we're checking if the list ID matches the list ID that we just updated. And if it does, we replace that list with the updated data from the server. And if not, we just keep the existing list the same. So when you run map, it iterates over the entire lists array, takes in each list, and then whatever you return here is going to be stored at that index. So we're basically using a ternary operator to say if the list ID that we're currently looping through matches the list ID that we just updated, give us the data we received back from the server. Otherwise, leave it alone. And now if it fails, we'll say error value equals E, response, data, message, or we'll default to error, updating list, please try again. There we go. So now we have an update function. And so last we'll handle deleting. So we'll say loading, delete, true, error, null. We'll add another try catch. Now if it fails, we'll just say error, E, response, data, message, or default to error deleting list, please try again. Now for delete, if you remember here, our delete endpoint expects a delete request to lists / and then we pass in the list ID as a URL parameter. So we're going to say response equals await Axios delete. And we're going to use backticks again. We're going to say API / lists. Then we'll pass in the list ID. And so in our delete list function declaration, we need to pass in that list ID, and that's all we need. Now we can just console log the response data. Because if you remember in our task list, our delete function just returns a message, and the message is just successfully deleted. So we'll just log that just to make sure it's working. And now we're going to use a function similar to the map function. And if you ever used it before, I'm sure you know what's coming, but it's going to be the filter function. So let's write it out, and then I'll explain how it works. And so filter does exactly what it says it does. It filters out results. And so what it does is it checks every item in the array, and it only keeps the ones that pass this test. So in this case, we're keeping all the lists where the list ID is not equal to the list that we just deleted. This effectively will remove the list that we deleted from this lists value array. So it loops through the entire lists array, checks each item, and compares the list ID to the list ID that we just deleted. If it does not match, it keeps that item. If it does match, it removes it and passes back a brand new array without that list inside. All right, so now we've got all our functionality built for our list store, and we can start working on our task store. So we'll do our standard imports up top, and we'll define our export. Call this one use task store. And now we're just going to define some variables similar to the list store. So we'll define our tasks array, some loading variables, some errors, and now we're going to define a few functions. Get list tasks, which is going to be asynchronous. It'll take in a list ID, and that'll be the function that gets all of our tasks associated to a given list. We'll have our add task method, which takes in a list ID and task data. Because remember, every task has to be associated to a list, so we're going to pass in the list ID we want to associate it to and the data associated to that task. Then we'll create our update task, which takes in the task ID we want to update and the data, and our delete task, which just takes in a task ID that we want to delete. Now we'll return all these states and actions. All right. Now let's flesh out some of this functionality. And a lot of this will be similar to what we just did in the list store, but for our tasks. Find and try catch. Now in our try, if you remember here for our task routes, to get all of the tasks associated to a given list, we use the task/list, and then we pass in the list ID to the endpoint. So let's go ahead and do that. Say response equals await Axios. We'll send a GET request. Say API tasks list, and we'll pass in the list ID. And now once we have those tasks, we're going to set it to the tasks array value. We'll set that to the response data. Because if you look in our task controller, our list show is going to grab all the tasks and return just the tasks as our data. So this response.data is going to be the tasks that we just pulled from the database, and it'll assign it to this tasks state. Now we'll set up our add task and a simple try catch. And if this fails, we want to console log the error. We want to set our create errors state to the response data errors property. Or by default, we're going to set this to an object, because if you remember, in our store, if this fails, we're sending back the validation errors in this errors property. And the validation errors is an object with keys that map to arrays of all of the errors associated to that key. So if the name has errors, it'll be an array of all the errors associated to name. If status has errors, it'll be all the errors associated to that, and so on. So by default, if this is empty, we still want to pass back the same structure that we would get from our errors property so that we can handle it the same way. So we'll just say default, and we'll give it an array with one item, error adding task. And now if that fails, we'll return false. And now if you look in here, for our add task, we're posting to /tasks/list, and then we're passing in the list ID. So let's go ahead and do that. And we'll take the list ID that we received as a parameter when we call this function. And then we also want to pass in the task data. And now if that succeeds, it just sends back the task that was created. So we just want to push that value into our tasks array. So we'll say tasks value push response.data. We'll return true. Now for our update task, we'll add the loading update, and we'll add a typical try catch. And if it fails, we'll set that error value to the response data message, or we'll default to error updating task. We'll return false. Now here, we want a response to await Axios, and we're sending a patch request. And if you remember, we're sending that patch request to /tasks, and we're passing in the task ID that we want to update along with the task data. So we'll say patch API tasks. We'll pass in the task ID, and then we'll pass along the tasks data as the body. And now if this succeeds, we're going to do something very similar to our update in our lists store, and we're going to use that map function. But we'll do so for tasks. So we'll say tasks value equals tasks value map. We'll check the task, and we'll return if task ID is equal to the task that we just updated, then give me the data back from the server. Otherwise, we just want the task to stay the same. Return true. And last but not least, our delete function. And now if this fails, we'll just set the error value message, or by default, error deleting task. And now for our Axios request, we send a delete request to /tasks, and we pass in just the task ID. And in that function, we're going to use the task ID to check and see if it belongs to the user, and if it does, we'll delete it. So we'll say response await Axios, and we'll send a delete request to API tasks task ID. We can console log response data, and now we're going to use that same filter function to update our tasks array. And we'll only return back the tasks that pass this expression. If the task ID is not equal to the task ID that we just deleted, we want to keep it, otherwise remove it. And that'll update our tasks array by pulling out the one task that we just deleted. So now we've built our task store and our list store, and we can start working with our API to manipulate some data. And there we go. We've got a list store and a task store capable of handling all of the communication between our backend API and returning all that data to our front end. Now, in the next video, we're going to build out our forms, and then from there, we're going to work on our dashboard to implement this functionality into our SPA. So make sure you stick around for the next one, and as always, happy coding.